Strasbourg, July 1518. The summer air clung heavy with heat, pressing down on narrow medieval streets. Merchants wiped sweat from their brows. Bakers cursed the ovens that seemed hotter than the sun, and peasants collapsed in the fields under an unforgiving sky. But among the ordinary misery of that summer, something began that would terrify the world for centuries to come. A madness, born not of plague or war, but of dance. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments, you better remember. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of forgotten history, subscribe to Cold Mysteries, because tonight you will hear of a story that even science refuses to explain. Now, let us return to Strasbourg, where one woman began to dance and could not stop. It began with Frau Troffea, the wife of a common tradesman. On a blistering July morning, she walked into the narrow cobbled street outside her home. Without music, without joy, without even a trace of reason, she began to move her body. At first, her neighbors thought it strange but harmless. Perhaps she was drunk, perhaps she sought attention. But the way her limbs jerked was not graceful. It was violent, sharp, unnatural. She spun, stamped her feet, clutched her chest, then flung her arms into the air. As if dragged by invisible strings, hours passed. Sweat poured from her skin. Her dress clung to her trembling frame, yet she did not stop. By the time dusk fell, Frau Troffea had danced nearly 12 hours straight. When her husband and neighbors tried to restrain her, she resisted with terrifying strength. She collapsed only at midnight, trembling, her lips foaming, her eyes glassy. And when dawn returned, she rose, walked back to the street, and began again. Within a week, 30 more people had joined her. Men, women, even children. They were not celebrating. Their faces twisted with exhaustion, eyes wide with horror, as though their own bodies had betrayed them. Witnesses swore they screamed for help, while their feet pounded the stones bloody. Some begged priests to exorcise them even as their bodies convulsed to a rhythm no one else could hear. The city began to panic. Strasbourg had seen famine, disease, even war. But never this. People who watched too closely soon found their own legs twitching, their own hearts racing until they too joined the growing throng of dancers. By midsummer, the number had swelled to over 100. The dancing was no festival. There was no music, no laughter. The square stank of sweat and blood. Some dancers collapsed from heart failure, others foamed at the mouth. Doctors bled them, priests prayed for them, but nothing worked. Every night the dancers filled the streets, stamping, twirling, convulsing, some for hours, others for days, until they collapsed lifeless. And yet, even in death, some claimed their bodies twitched, as if the dance refused to release them. This was no ordinary sickness. The dancing plague was not carried by fleas nor spread by blood. It traveled in another way, through the eyes, through the mind, through the soul itself. And though it began with one woman, within weeks it had consumed hundreds. A madness that no prayer, no medicine, no wall of silence could stop. But the most terrifying question is not why it began. It is why it did not end. By late July, the madness had consumed more than 100 people. Strasbourg's narrow streets echoed with the thunder of feet-pounding stone. Night after night, as if the city itself had been possessed. No corner was safe, no family untouched, and the leaders of Strasbourg were desperate for an answer. The city magistrates first called upon the physicians, learned men, draped in robes, armed with their books and their bloodletting knives. They examined the dancers and concluded it was no curse, no possession but a disease of the blood. They claimed the sufferers had been afflicted with hot blood, overheated humors boiling in their veins. The cure, they insisted, was not restraint, but more dancing. So the council ordered musicians to play, hired pipers and drummers, and even constructed a stage in the very heart of the city. And thus the streets of Strasbourg transformed into an open-air nightmare. To the frantic pounding of drums, the dancers spun faster, their limbs cracking, their bodies collapsing. Physicians nodded in approval. while mothers screamed at the sight of their children, bleeding through their shoes. But not all agreed with the doctors. The clergy saw something darker. To them this was divine punishment and a plague of penance. The dancers were sinners, whipped into frenzy by St. Vitus himself, patron of epileptics, who was said to curse the disobedient with uncontrollable motion. The priests demanded the council stop the music. They urged fasting, prayer, and pilgrimage. Some dragged dancers to the cathedral steps, pressing holy water to their lips, whispering exorcisms as their heads snapped violently side to side. But the convulsions did not stop. Even within the shadow of the cathedral, the dancers moved, their eyes glassy, their voices whispering in tongues no priest could recognize. As weeks dragged on, the dancing became a spectacle of horror. Merchants leaned from their windows, counting bodies. Children mimicked the spasms in cruel play until their own feet betrayed them. The city square reeked of blood and rot. Shoes lay shredded, discarded in piles. Rats scurried through the gutters, feeding on scraps dropped by onlookers too frightened to intervene. Some dancers collapsed and died where they stood, their hearts ruptured. Others, carried away by families, awoke days later only to return to the square, compelled by an unseen force, and those who managed to resist began to fear the pull of the plague more than death itself. They swore they could hear the music even in silence. By early August, more than 400 people were trapped in the madness. The city's leaders realized that their physician's cure had only fanned the flames. The music they had ordered filled the streets, not with healing, but with death. And yet, Strasbourg was paralyzed. The council feared banning the dancing outright would only anger God further. The priests bickered among themselves. Some declared the dancers saints, others cursed them as heretics. And in the middle of it all, the people of Strasbourg lived in constant dread. Each night, as the bells tolled, families locked their doors, praying that their loved ones would not rise from bed and walk, against their will, toward the cursed square. The city thought they could explain it. They thought it was blood, or sin, or punishment. But the truth was far darker, because as the madness spread, the dancing began to change. It was no longer just motion, no longer just exhaustion. The dancers began to speak, and what they said no one dared to write down. The people of Strasbourg had grown used to the sight of bodies convulsing in the streets. They had seen their neighbors collapse foaming at the mouth, and they had heard the drumbeats that drove the plague deeper into the bones of the afflicted. But what happened next was far more terrifying, because soon the dancers began to speak. At first, it seemed like incoherent muttering, cries of exhaustion, desperate prayers muttered through clenched teeth. But then witnesses swore they heard words distinct, deliberate. Some claimed the dancers cried the names of saints. Others said they cursed the city, spitting venom in languages long forgotten. A few whispered that they heard prophecies, warnings of fires, floods, and famine yet to come. Merchants who had once laughed nervously at the spectacle now barred their shutters, too afraid to listen. The words are not theirs, one mother told the council. It is the devil speaking through their mouths. More horrifying still, children began to fall victim. Whole families were dragged into the square. One chronicler described a boy of no more than 10 years, who danced until his feet bled, his tiny body jerking as though caught on invisible hooks. When finally restrained, he whispered in a voice far too old for his years, "It will not stop. It will never stop. We dance because he demands it." The crowd fell silent. The boy's own father fled, convinced his son was possessed. By mid-August, witnesses described hallucinations spreading among the dancers. Some cried out that they were drowning, clutching their throats and gasping for breath while their feet continued to hammer the ground. Others screamed that they were burning alive, tearing at their clothes as though consumed by invisible flames. A group of women collapsed together, shrieking that St. Vitus himself stood among them, cracking a whip, forcing them to move faster, harder, until their bones cracked under the strain. Doctors scribbled useless notes. Priests clutched their rosaries. And yet the dancers kept moving. The contagion of fear leapt beyond the city walls. Villagers in the countryside swore they heard phantom drum beats at night. Some even claimed their own legs began to twitch when they dreamt of Strasbourg. Letters carried the news to other towns. A madness in the city. A plague of dancing that killed as swiftly as any sword. Across the Rhine, whispers spread that Strasbourg had angered God, and that their suffering was only the beginning. By now, more than 400 souls had been consumed. The city council, once confident in the doctor's remedies, admitted defeat. They turned back to the priests, begging for divine intervention. But even the church fractured under the strain. Some bishops insisted on exorcisms. Others demanded pilgrimages to the shrine of St. Vitus, far from the city. Still others warned that Strasbourg itself had become cursed, a place abandoned by God where even prayer could not survive.
And yet, nothing worked.
Narrator, slower, deeper, pulling the words like an omen. The people of Strasbourg thought they had seen every form of suffering, but the dancing plague was not finished with them yet. For soon, the madness would take its deadliest turn.
Hearts would burst in the streets.
Entire families would vanish into the frenzy. And the question that haunted the survivors was not how many had died, but how many more the dance intended to claim. By late August, Strasbourg was no longer a city.
It was a stage,
and death was the only audience. The dancing plague had turned its victims into puppets, and one by one, the strings began to snap. Chroniclers tell us that dozens collapsed in a single week. Physicians who once prescribed more movement now recorded the same grim pattern again and again. Faces drained of color, lips purple, eyes bulging with pressure. They danced until their hearts exploded. Some fell mid-step, their bodies striking the cobblestones with sickening cracks. Others stiffened where they stood, twitching as their final breath left them. And still the drummers played, too terrified to stop, pounding their instruments as if afraid silence itself would kill them. Entire households were consumed. A mother pulled into the square by her husband's hand, only to collapse hours later as their children screamed. Young women fainted in the heat, only to awaken thrashing, their feet betraying them again. Witnesses wrote that fathers abandoned their families, fleeing the city, unwilling to risk the invisible contagion. Children were left in doorways, crying for mothers who would never return. Strasbourg became a graveyard, even while its people still moved. The council chambers reeked of incense and fear. Officials debated as bodies piled in the streets. To admit failure was unthinkable. To deny the plague was impossible. Some argued that the madness was a punishment unique to Strasbourg, that leaving the city untouched might spread the curse elsewhere. Others demanded soldiers to force the dancers into confinement. But how do you chain 1,000 legs that refuse to stop moving? By now, the music had taken on a sinister life of its own. The drummers and pipers, once paid to encourage the afflicted, played in tears. They admitted their hands shook, their ears rang, and they too feared they would be next. Merchants began to hear phantom tunes, even when no musician was near. The entire city seemed to vibrate with an unseen
rhythm, a heartbeat beneath the cobblestones.
Some claimed the music was not of men at all, but of hell itself, bleeding into Strasbourg through cracks no one could see. With despair thick in the air, the priests demanded one final desperate measure. Pilgrimages were ordered to the shrine of St. Vitus miles away. Those strong enough to walk were dragged along roads, their bodies convulsing as though resisting salvation. At the shrine, priests pressed relics to their skin, bound their feet, and prayed with trembling voices. Some victims collapsed into silence, their bodies limp at last. Others screamed louder, their spasms worsening under the weight of holy relics. The clergy began to fear they had not banished the curse, but strengthened it. Word of the plague's devastation spread across Europe. From Basel to Paris, whispers grew. Strasbourg was cursed, abandoned by God, a city of dancers who died with broken feet and shattered hearts. Merchants avoided the markets. Travelers turned back at the gates, Strasbourg was no longer a city of trade and faith, but of death and madness. And those who survived would carry the memory forever. Survivors swore that long after the plague eased, they still heard the phantom drum beats in their sleep. Some claimed their legs twitched at night, years after the square had emptied. By September, Strasbourg was a city on its knees.
Hundreds were dead. Hundreds more hovered on the edge of exhaustion.
But still, the dancing did not stop, and soon the council would make its most desperate decision yet, one that would lead the survivors into forests, shrines and secrets that the city dared never write down. By September of 1518, Strasbourg was no longer simply afflicted, it was haunted. The council, battered by failure, turned at last to the church, and so began a pilgrimage that was meant to cure the dancers. But instead,
etched their terror deeper into history.
City guards and priests moved in pairs, seizing the afflicted wherever they convulsed. Some dancers resisted, their feet thrashing against the cobblestones as though nailed to the rhythm. Others collapsed in relief, begging to be taken away. They were bound with ropes, placed on carts, and carried like criminals through the gates of Strasbourg. Witnesses said the sound of the city fell quiet as they departed, as if Strasbourg itself held its breath. The path to the shrine of Saint Vitus wound through forests and fields, but for the afflicted it became a gauntlet. Their bodies convulsed even as they were dragged, their eyes rolling wildly, mouths foaming with prayers and curses alike. Peasants along the road knelt in fear, crossing themselves. Some swore they saw shadows moving at the edge of the woods, figures that danced in silence, keeping pace with the pilgrims, though no human feet touched the earth. At the shrine, priests prepared rites, both sacred and desperate. Victims' feet were anointed with holy oil. Iron shoes were strapped on to weigh down their steps. Relics of the saint, bones, cloth, and fragments of wood were pressed against their skin. Some fell still immediately, their bodies limp, their faces slack with exhaustion. Others thrashed harder, shrieking as though the saint himself was scourging them. A priest recorded in his diary, "We anoint their flesh, but it burns as though fire touches them.
I fear these are not cures,
but punishments." When night fell, the afflicted were locked inside the chapel. Guards swore that even with the doors barred, they heard movement, dozens of feet stamping in perfect rhythm.
and then voices.
Not the voices of prayer, but of laughter. Low, echoing, impossible laughter, spilling from the chapel into the forest night. Some guards fled, refusing to return. Those who stayed claimed they saw pale faces at the windows, pressed against the glass, smiling in the moonlight. By morning, a number of victims lay still. Some breathed faintly, cured by exhaustion.
Others were undeniably dead.
But a small group emerged with eerie clarity. Their eyes were calm, their movements deliberate. They walked from the shrine as though nothing had ever afflicted them. When questioned, they said little, only that they had danced with Saint Vitus, and that the city would never understand. Strasbourg's council, desperate for good news, declared the ritual a success. But the priests muttered among themselves. These were not healed men and women, they whispered. They were changed. The remaining afflicted were brought back into Strasbourg, but their presence only deepened the dread. Markets emptied, families shuttered their homes. Merchants refused to trade, convinced the very earth beneath the city was cursed. One chronicler wrote, "Better a plague of fire or flood than this, for at least fire consumes,
And flood passes.
this dance lingers like a shadow on the soul." The pilgrimage to St. Vitus was meant to end the horror, but for Strasbourg it was only another chapter, because when the victims returned, the council discovered something far more unsettling. The dance had not ended.
It had only...
Changed its rhythm.
The pilgrimage had ended.
The ropes were untied, the afflicted had been dragged home, and Strasbourg was left to count its dead. But in the streets and houses where the survivors walked, something was different. The dance had not vanished. It had only slipped into silence. Families wept when their loved ones returned from St. Vitus's shrine. Some fell to their knees, kissing dirt-stained feet. praising God for his mercy. The council paraded the so-called healed as proof of victory. But within days, neighbors began whispering. These survivors were not as they had been. They moved too carefully, too smoothly, as if testing every step. At night, some were seen standing at windows, rocking gently, swaying though no music played. Others stared for hours at nothing, their lips twitching as if repeating a silent song. One merchant reported his wife laughing in her sleep, her hands twitching in the air as though playing invisible instruments. A child survivor stopped speaking altogether, but every night her heels tapped against the floorboards until dawn. Priests sent to bless these households claimed the air inside felt wrong. Thick, charged, as if waiting for something. One priest wrote bitterly in his diary, "I believe we did not cure them. We only taught them to hide the rhythm." Doctors in Strasbourg scrambled to explain the plague. Some declared it an illness of the blood, an overheated humoral imbalance caused by bread, wine, and August's relentless heat. Others swore it was mass hysteria, the madness of crowds feeding upon itself. But the people clung to darker tales. They whispered that the survivors had made a bargain with Saint Vitus himself or something far older. That the dance was a curse which demanded new hosts, passed through the eyes and breath of those who watched too long. Mothers covered their children's faces when passing the afflicted, fearing a single glance would infect them. Markets grew silent. The city's pulse slowed, but dread thickened. By October, the streets of Strasbourg were nearly empty. Merchants who dared to open their shops found themselves serving only silence.
Inns stood abandoned.
Even the cathedral bells rang hollow, echoing through deserted alleys. And yet, in the dead of night, some swore they heard it, faint footsteps echoing in courtyards, synchronized, deliberate. When lanterns were lit, the stones were bare, but the echoes lingered. The healed began gathering at strange hours.
In barns, in empty halls.
Always in small groups. Farmers who stumbled upon them reported seeing silent circles, men and women swaying together, their eyes closed, their movements disturbingly precise. When confronted, they denied it. But their neighbors remembered the haunted laughter that once filled Strasbourg's streets, and now feared it was rehearsing in secret. The council faced a terrifying truth. The pilgrimage had not saved the city. It had scattered the plague into its very homes. To arrest the survivors would be to admit defeat. To ignore them was to risk contagion anew. And so the council did nothing. A silence that would only feed the dread. Strasbourg was a city divided. Doctors spoke of humours, priests of saints, and the people of demons. But all agreed on one thing, the dance was not gone. It had sunk deeper like a river beneath the earth, waiting for its moment to rise again. And when it did, no wall, no prayer, no council decree would be enough to stop it. By winter's approach, Strasbourg had begun to whisper of a new terror. The streets no longer overflowed with dancers collapsing in daylight. Instead, shadows gathered in barns, in abandoned guild halls, in crumbling chapels. The dance had gone underground. Peasants returning, late from fields, spoke of strange flickers of lamplight in deserted quarters of the city. Those brave enough to peer inside swore they saw men and women.
The survivors of the plague.
Swaying in silence, no fiddles, no drums, just the sound of their bare feet on the wooden floors, moving in perfect rhythm, as if following a beat only they could hear. Witnesses said their eyes were closed, their expressions serene, as though caught in a dream. But when disturbed, they stopped abruptly and stared with such coldness that intruders fled before a word was spoken. The council tried to suppress the rumors. They issued proclamations. The plague is over.
The city is safe.
But the people were not convinced. Merchants refused to set up stalls.
Mothers pulled their children from the streets.
The cathedral itself stood half empty at Sunday Mass. Some believed the survivors were possessed, cursed to spread St. Vitus's vengeance. Others believed they had unlocked a holy ecstasy, a glimpse into divine joy that ordinary mortals could not endure. Strasbourg became a city of factions. Priests warned of demons. Physicians argued over humors, and the common folk, trapped between fear and fascination, began to watch the survivors more closely than ever. By December, the gatherings grew bolder. Small at first, 6, then 10, then dozens. And their movements were no longer wild or convulsive. Instead, they were precise, controlled, choreographed even. Observers described lines of dancers swaying in unison, their steps looping back on themselves in patterns that seemed almost mathematical. Circles within circles, spirals crossing paths that always returned to perfect order. It was no longer madness, it was ritual. One scribe, Johann Keller, claimed he stumbled upon such a gathering in an abandoned barn. In his journal he wrote, "They moved as one body, one rhythm, though no sound guided them."
I felt it in my chest, as though my own heart sought to match their beat.
A woman opened her eyes mid-step and looked directly at me. Her gaze was calm, almost pitying.
I fled before she could speak, but even now when I close my eyes, I feel the rhythm in my blood.
The council confiscated Keller's journal, but whispers of it spread like fire. Soon, anyone who tapped a foot absent-mindedly in the marketplace was eyed with suspicion. A cough, a sway, a hum of a forgotten tune, all became signs of possible infection.
Families turned against each other.
Husbands accused wives. Children were hidden indoors.
And still the gatherings grew.
By candlelight, survivors began incorporating objects into their silent rites: crosses, candles, bones of animals. Farmers claimed they saw strange markings carved into barn floors where the dancers met. Spirals, stars, and sigils burned into the wood. When questioned, the survivors remained silent. They did not deny. They did not explain. They only smiled faintly, as if keeping a secret meant only for themselves. The open madness of July had been terrifying, yes. But what grew in the shadows of December was far worse. For chaos can burn itself out, but ritual endures. And Strasbourg was beginning to realize that what plagued them was not simply an illness of the body, something older, deeper, and far more patient. By the turn of the year, Strasbourg was no longer a city of trade and worship.
It was a city of suspicion. Every alley carried whispers. Every home hid its fear.
And behind shuttered windows, people listened not for footsteps, but for the faint rhythm of secret gathering. The council could no longer ignore it.
Action was inevitable.
Merchants who once competed for customers now competed for survival. Some accused rivals of harboring dancers.
Old feuds turned into denunciations.
A butcher pointed to his neighbor's barn, claiming he saw flickering candles and silhouettes moving past midnight. The council seized on these reports. They formed patrols, armed not with swords, but with torches and writs of authority. By January, Strasbourg's nights were filled with the sound of boots on cobblestone, searching for shadows that swayed. The first raid took place on a bitterly cold night in late January. A group of 10 men stormed a grain warehouse said to host the afflicted. Inside, they found 30 people, men,
women, even children, moving in perfect unison.
No instruments, no voices, just bare feet brushing across the dusty floor. Every heel falling in rhythm as though guided by something unseen. When the torches lit the hall, the dancers did not scatter. They froze all at once like statues.
Then every head turned toward the intruders.
30 pairs of eyes, wide and unblinking, staring into the flames. The patrol fled before a word was spoken. At dawn, the men swore to never enter such a place again. But the council pressed harder. More raids, more crackdowns. Each time the same pattern. Silent dancers swaying until torches arrived. Then stillness.
Eyes fixed on the intruders.
No resistance, no words. Just silence so heavy it broke the courage of even the bravest. The councillors began to wonder who was truly being watched. One raid, however, did not end in silence. In February, a small patrol entered an abandoned church where dozens were rumored to gather. As the doors creaked open, the men froze. The nave was filled, not with chaos, but with precision. Dozens of survivors moving in spirals, their steps forming patterns across the stone floor. At the center of the spiral stood a young woman, her arms raised. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving soundlessly. And yet, the dancer's steps matched her unseen command.
One guard swore he heard something faint, not music, but a low hum.
Not with his ears, but with his bones.
A vibration, deep and unnatural, pulling at his very heartbeat.
Terrified, he shouted for the others to flee. But as they turned, the woman opened her eyes. They were black, entirely impossibly black. The patrol dropped their torches and stumbled into the night. The church was abandoned by morning, but the men never spoke again, save to confess one thing: they no longer believed this was an illness. When word leaked of the black-eyed woman, Strasbourg dissolved into panic. Families locked their doors. Priests spoke of possession. Physicians denounced it as hysteria, but their voices shook as they spoke. Markets emptied once more. Children cried at night, asking their parents if the dance would come for them next. And the council, once so proud, found itself paralyzed. They had seen what science could not explain. The open madness of summer had become something darker, something deliberate, and the question haunted Strasbourg: if the dance could command silence, precision, and even the very eyes of its victims, what else might it command? By spring of 1519, Strasbourg was no longer governed by laws, nor by trade, nor by reason. It was governed by fear. The council, once proud, had been reduced to whispers in their chambers.
Merchants had fled, leaving shutters nailed tight.
Mothers wept at night, praying their children would not rise in dreams and begin to move their feet.
And the priests?
They turned, at last, to the only weapon they believed remained:
Holy ritual.
From the great cathedral, a decree was issued. The dancing sickness was no longer to be treated by physicians or by city patrols. It was to be met with exorcism. Processions of monks and priests walked through the streets with incense, chanting psalms, sprinkling holy water over doorframes. The people, desperate, followed them in droves. Some knelt in the mud, clutching rosaries until their fingers bled. Others demanded that the afflicted be burned, their bodies destroyed before the plague spread further. In March, a group of priests stormed the same abandoned church where the black-eyed woman had last been seen.
Inside, they found more than 50 dancers swaying in unison.
The priests raised crucifixes high, their chants thundering through the rafters. For a moment it seemed to work. The dancers faltered, their steps slowing, their heads trembling as though shaken from a dream. Hope sparked in the priest's eyes. But then, all at once, the dancers dropped to their knees. Their arms rose as one, palms outstretched not in surrender, but in worship. And they began to hum. Witnesses described the sound as low, deep, vibrating through the very marrow. The crucifixes trembled in the priest's hands. Candles flickered violently, though no wind stirred. The chants of the priests faltered. Their words crumbled into silence as the hum grew louder, until it filled every corner of the nave, rattling the very stones. And then the black-eyed woman appeared once more. This time she did not stand at the center. She walked slowly toward the priests, her eyes void, her lips parted in a faint, almost gentle smile. The monks dropped their censers. One priest fainted outright. The others fled, their chants forgotten, their faith shattered. Word of the failed exorcism spread faster than any disease. Strasbourg's council, already paralyzed, dissolved into open panic. Half resigned their posts and fled the city. The rest hid in their homes, sending no more patrols, issuing no more decrees. The people were left alone, abandoned by both church and state. And in that void, the gatherings grew. By April, barns and churches alike were filled with swaying figures, hundreds at a time, moving in spirals, humming that same bone-rattling song. Strasbourg had once been a jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, city of trade, of prayer, of wealth. But by the spring of 1519 it belonged to something else entirely, not to merchants nor bishops nor lords. It belonged to the rhythm, and the rhythm was spreading. By the summer of 1519, Strasbourg was no longer a city in crisis. It was a city
in surrender.
No priests came with crosses, no patrols with torches.
No council decrees.
The people had stopped resisting, stopped reporting, stopped even whispering, for the dance had outlived their will to fight it. In July, survivors spoke of a night when hundreds filled the cathedral square. No one had summoned them.
No bells rang.
Yet the afflicted emerged from alleys, barns, churches and homes, all moving toward the same place, their steps dragging across cobblestones, their bodies jerking in eerie rhythm. Witnesses swore the air itself seemed to pulse. Dogs howled, horses reared. Even those untouched by the plague felt their chests tighten, as though something invisible pressed upon their lungs.
And then they danced.
For hours, hundreds of bodies moved as one, collapsing from exhaustion only to rise again. The hum, with that dreadful, marrow-deep vibration, shook windows, rattled beams, and silenced even the night insects. At the center of it all was the woman with the black eyes, her hands raised, her lips curled in that faint, impossible smile. Just before dawn, the frenzy reached its peak. People foamed at the mouth, their eyes rolled back, their limbs snapping in unnatural angles. And then, as the sun crested the horizon, and it ended.
Not with screams.
Not with collapse, but with silence.
Hundreds of dancers froze mid-motion, arms still raised, mouths still parted.
And then one by one, they fell. Some gasped their last breath. Others lay unconscious, never to rise. And when the townsfolk dared to step into the square, they found no sign of the black-eyed woman. She was gone. In the days that followed, Strasbourg became a graveyard. Entire families lost. Merchants returned to empty shops. Priests preached of punishment, though their voices shook. Physicians muttered of fevers and vapors, but offered no cure. And yet, after that morning, no more dancers rose. The hum ceased. The rhythm was gone. The city was left scarred, hollow, and terrified of its own memory. Some said it was ergot poisoning, bread laced with mold that poisoned the mind. Others swore it was mass hysteria, born of famine and fear. But bread does not make bodies move in perfect unison. Hysteria does not give one woman black eyes, nor command silence across hundreds. Science could not explain it, faith could not cure it, and history could not forget it. Even now, more than 5 centuries later, records remain in Strasbourg's archives, notes from physicians, letters from priests, diaries of merchants who fled. They all agree on one thing, that the people of Strasbourg danced themselves to death. But between those lines lies something darker, something no one could write without trembling, because the question that remains is not how they danced, but what they were dancing for. And so the square of Strasbourg still stands, paved with the same stones that once echoed with impossible footsteps. If you walk there today, you will see tourists, markets, laughter. But some say when night falls and the wind moves just right, the stones hum, faintly, a rhythm, too deep for the ears, but enough to make your chest tighten. Would you dare to listen? If you've been haunted by tonight's story,
Let me ask you, where in the world are you watching from?
leave a comment below. And if you want more stories that history tried to bury, but shadows refused to forget, then subscribe to Cold Mysteries. Because every day we unearth the past's darkest secrets and share them with you.